Welcome to the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition.
Great to be here.
Today we are opening up a truly transformative work, Living Black History, how reimagining the African American past can remake America's racial future by Manning Marable. We thank you for listening, and please consider subscribing for future content. After hearing this, we would encourage you to go out and purchase this book and support the author.
Absolutely.
The voices you hear come from AI, but the content comes straight from the book. And we feel that this is, a great way to learn about African American history.
It really is. And when you hear a history book, you kind of brace yourself for a dry timeline.
Right. First this happened, then that happened.
Exactly. But Marable is doing something totally different here. He's making an argument that history isn't just a record of stuff that's over and done with.
No, he calls it a battlefield.
A battlefield. It's an active site of struggle where we're actually fighting over what the future looks like.
That is such an intense way to put it, but it makes perfect sense. I mean, if you control the story of how we got here, you basically control the conversation about where we should go next.
That's it. That's the whole game. And Marable, who was just a giant in this field, he lays out a mission for this book. He wants to dismantle what he calls the master narrative of American history.
The master narrative. Okay, so that sounds like the version of history we all got in grade school.
Pretty much.
George Washington, the cherry tree, Lincoln frees the slaves, Martin Luther King has a dream, and problem solved. A nice, clean line of progress.
Precisely. The master narrative is the sanitized version. It's all about harmony and unity all pluribus on and everyone assimilating.
But to make that story work, you have to leave a lot out.
You have to actively suppress the messy parts. You have to hide the evidence of conflict, of resistance, of the systems that were built to keep people down. And Marable says this isn't an accident. It's a tool to maintain the status quo.
He has some really powerful examples of this. The one that got me was about, the presidential estates.
Oh, Mount Vernon and Monticello.
Yeah. For decades, the tour guides would point to the buildings where enslaved people lived and call them servants' quarters.
Such a subtle change of words, isn't it? Servant.
But it does so much work. A servant gets paid, a servant can quit. It completely erases the violence of chattel slavery and just replaces it with this, cozy image.
It protects the visitor from the uncomfortable truth, from the fact that these founding fathers owned other human beings.
And that's a relatively mild example. He also talks about Rosewood, Florida, which wasn't renaming, it was literal erasure.
Yes, the 1923 massacre. A white mob didn't just burn down the black community of Rosewood.
They wiped it off the map.
Literally. Wiped it off the map, removed the physical evidence that a town, that a community had ever even existed. For decades, it was just a blank space. That's the master narrative in action. It creates a void.
So if that's the cover-up, Marable's solution is what he calls living history, which it sounds like we have to become forensic investigators.
That's a great way to put it. We have to reclaim the raw truth from oral histories, from artifacts before they're gone forever. And he tells this one story in the book that, honestly, it just stopped me in my tracks.
This is the visit to Medgar Evers' home.
Yes. With his widow, Merle Evers Williams.
Right. Evers, the NAACP field secretary in Mississippi, assassinated in his own driveway in 1963.
And this scene is it's incredibly heavy. They're standing in that driveway on the exact spot. And Merle tells Marable that for days after he was killed, she would come out at night with a brush and a bucket.
Oh, no.
Trying to scrub her husband's blood out of the concrete. She said she scrubbed and scrubbed, but the stain just wouldn't come out.
That image it's so visceral. A literal stain that can't be washed away.
It's haunting. And then she takes him inside, and he walks into the kitchen and sees the refrigerator, and there's still a bullet hole in it.
Still there. After all those years.
Still there. The bullet that killed Medgar went through his body, through the window, ricocheted off the fridge, and landed on the kitchen counter.
Wow.
And Marable notes that right next to where the bullet landed, there was a watermelon.
I remember reading that and just having to put the book down. A watermelon. It's so mundane, so domestic.
Right.
It reminds you, this wasn't just some abstract civil rights icon. This was a dad coming home to his family.
Yeah.
It makes the violence feel so real.
It grounds it. But here's the part that explains why living history is so urgent. Marable finds out that shortly after the murder, the staff at the local NAACP office, they were just overcome.
With grief, with trauma, I'm sure.
Exactly. And in a daze, they packed up 20 drawers of Medgar Evers' files, his notes, his investigations, all the threats he received, and they threw them in a dumpster.
They threw them away. 20 drawers of history.
Gone. Just destroyed. And that's what Marable means when he says Black history is fragile. If we don't actively work to preserve it, it physically disappears. And the master narrative wins by default.
Because there's no evidence left to contradict it. That is terrifying. And this destruction isn't always physical, right? Sometimes you destroy a legacy by sanitizing it.
Which brings us to W.E.B. Du Bois.
Oh, absolutely. Du Bois is a titan. But Marable argues the Du Bois we celebrate today is kind of a fabrication. We've turned him into a statue.
He talks about that big gala in 2003 for the centennial of the souls of Black folk.
Right. A black tie affair, politicians, corporate sponsors like Daimler Chrysler, and they're all there to toast Du Bois. But Marable sees this huge irony in the room.
They're celebrating the safe Du Bois.
The Du Bois of 1903. The poet who wrote about the veil and double consciousness.
And we should probably just quickly define that double consciousness is that feeling of seeing yourself through the eyes of a racist society, right?
Yes, exactly. Being, as he put it, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts. And it's a brilliant critical concept, but it's observational. It describes the problem.
It doesn't call for burning the system down, which is why the corporate sponsors were comfortable applauding it. They completely ignored the radical Du Bois, the man who lived and evolved for another 60 years.
They froze him in time.
They did. They don't want to talk about the man who became a socialist, the man who was a peace activist during the Cold War and was basically treated like a criminal by his own government.
And people forget how real that was. The government actually came after him.
They absolutely did. They revoked his passport. He was in his 80s, put in handcuffs, and treated like a traitor for daring to critique capitalism and imperialism.
And he ended up dying in Ghana. In exile.
As a member of the Communist Party. But you don't hear that part during Black History Month. And Marable says by sanitizing him, we're disrespecting him. We have to engage with his entire journey, his whole argument. Otherwise, we're not learning from him. We're just...
using him as a prop.
Exactly.
Wow. Using him as a prop. That is the perfect transition to maybe the most shocking part of the book for me. The dispossession of Malcolm X.
Yeah, this chapter is a hard one for a lot of people to swallow.
I mean, Malcolm X is an icon. In the 90s, the X hats were everywhere. Spike Lee's movie. He's this symbol of defiance.
Right. But Marable says we've been sold a hollowed-out version. He calls it dispossession, where you strip the person of their actual substance and just sell back the image.
And he points the finger at the very book that most of us learned about him from.
The Autobiography of Malcolm X.
Which is just mind-blowing. That book is treated like gospel. But it was a collaboration with Alex Haley. And Marable says Haley had his own agenda.
You have to look at who Alex Haley was. He was a Republican, an integrationist. He deeply disliked Black nationalism, and Marable's research looking at the drafts and letters showed that Haley was actively shaping the story.
Shaping it into what?
Into a specific redemption arc, the story of a demagogue who is saved at the end by becoming a more liberal, integrationist figure, a story that would make white readers feel comfortable.
He came around in the end?
Exactly. And to make that story work, things had to be cut. Marable confirms there are missing chapters, 3 whole chapters that were written for the book but taken out before it was published.
And what was in them? What were they hiding?
Malcolm's evolving political vision. And it wasn't just integration. He was moving toward a radical internationalism. He wanted to link the struggle of African Americans directly to the anti-colonial struggles in Africa and Asia.
So bigger than just a domestic issue.
Way bigger. He was planning to take the United States to the United Nations and charge them with human rights violations against its own citizens.
Okay, that is not integration. That is a geopolitical power move.
It's a terrifying move if you're the U.S. State Department, which is why those chapters had to go. Haley, the publisher. They needed a Malcolm who was a domestic figure, not a global revolutionary.
So by hiding that, they made his struggle smaller. They robbed future generations.
Especially the hip-hop generation, of a strategic roadmap. They got the attitude, the style, the bad boy image, but they didn't get the blueprint for what to do next.
It really makes you realize that what's left out of a book is just as important as what's in it. And this kind of erasure, this changing of the map, it also happened to our understanding of the law.
Which brings us to his critique of Brown versus Board of Education.
The 1954 Supreme Court decision. The happy ending in the master narrative, right? Segregation ends.
It was a victory, for sure, a massive one. It killed legal segregation. The whites-only signs came down.
Right.
But Marable says it was an unfulfilled promise because it never addressed the root of the problem. And he draws this really important distinction between segregation and structural racism.
Let's break that down because I think people use those terms interchangeably.
Yeah.
Segregation is the law saying you can't sit here.
Right. Structural racism is when the whole system, housing, schools, justice, is set up in a way that produces racist outcomes, even when the laws themselves are technically neutral.
So this is what he means by colorblind racism.
Yes. The new racial domain, the law doesn't mention race. It says, we fund schools based on local property taxes.
Sounds fair, right? On the surface, yeah.
But if you have a century of racist housing policies that forced Black families into neighborhoods with low property values, that neutral law guarantees that their schools will be underfunded. The structure is doing the racist work.
So the law says everyone's equal, but the structure says some people start the race 10 miles behind everyone else.
You got it. And because the law is colorblind, the master narrative can say, well, if you're still struggling, it must be your own fault. It ignores the history as how you get to mass incarceration. The laws don't say arrest Black men, but the system produces that result.
Which strips them of their voting rights, a new form of Jim Crow.
But it's harder to fight because there are no signs to protest. And this is why Marable says we need a new civil rights movement. The old movement fought for a seat at the lunch counter.
The new movement has to fight for who owns the restaurant.
It has to shift from integration to transformation. From asking for entry into existing institutions to building economic power and self-determination within the community.
It all comes back to that title, Living Black History. He's not telling us this to make us angry. He's telling us this because history is a tool.
It's a resource, a map. And if we're using the fake map, the master narrative, we can't understand why we're so lost. We can't figure out how to solve these problems because we're not even looking at the real causes.
We're trying to scrub the stain off the driveway without ever asking who fired the gun.
That's it. That is the core message of this book. We have to be brave enough to look at the blood, to look at the missing chapters. We have to let these historical figures be who they actually were, uncomfortable, radical, and authentic. Because only that truth is strong enough to build a real future on.
You know, this whole conversation, it really changes how I'll look at the next history book I pick up. I think I'm going to be a lot more suspicious of the happy ending.
And that's a good thing. Marable leaves us with this challenge, and it's a provocative one. If the history you're reading makes you feel comfortable and good about your country, you're probably not reading history. You're reading mythology.
True history should unsettle you. It should force you to ask hard questions. That's a powerful place to leave it.
It is.
Please subscribe and tell others about this podcast.
And we'd love to hear from you.
We ask you to suggest in the comments books that you would like to hear in future episodes. Thank you for subscribing and listening.